You all see this?
Yay.
Perfect. I just gotta.
I'm going to mute myself. Take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to my teaching. It's Capital and History. Does Marxism Even Matter? Is the subtitle. Before I started, I just wanted to advertise that we have a reading group, and that's Sunday, March 14th, 5 p.m. That's week 20 of our reading group, which is actually the spring semester syllabus. So I'll actually be presenting there Luxemburg's on the Spartacus program, which I really need to read. And these are the other, we have the essential and the supplementary readings. You know, the essentials marked by bullet points, supplementaries by plus signs. So yeah, this is normally, I guess this is kind of taking the place of a coffee break. Normally we'd sort of get together and discuss an article for the PR. Those are on Wednesdays at 5:30, I think. And if you ask for anything, actually someone could put the syllabus link to the reading group in the chat when they get the chance. But yeah, ask whatever you need
right now.
Yeah, we can give you those links. So first, I just wanted to start with a few introductory kind of extemporaneous remarks on this teach-in, how it might differ a little bit from other capital and history teach-ins, not too much. It's a little bit top heavy is my main point. And that has to do actually with the current reading group we're on. So normally someone would have a teach-in around the start of the fall semester, kind of contemporaneously with the opening few weeks. And that would sort of be to reflect the bourgeois philosophy of history and also the sort of stuff that you need to know leading into Marx. And then we do 10 weeks of Marx, where kind of the main thing that's solidified is Marx's understanding of historical regression. Chris Cutrone in his Capital and History article, which is what this teach-in is kind of based on, doesn't really mention regression except to say that he's tabling it. But this teach-in is going to kind of try to condense some of the points from 10 weeks of Marxism just for pedagogical purposes, to try to get people acquainted with kind of what took place during the fall reading group. And I'm not too experienced with the fall reading group. I've only been through it once. So I might have missed a few points or missed a few important key things, but the point isn't really to be correct all the time so much as to provoke questions. So this time span of this teaching runs from 10,000 BCE to 1858, and that's around the time Marx published his Grundrisse. There are maybe a few conceptual tools that could be in handy just to sort of understand what I'm going to be talking about. And I won't have too many PowerPoint slides. It'll just be kind of one big slide with a kind of focused object. But so I guess really what to ask is kind of like, what is contradiction and what is the dialectic? And I would say very briefly, contradiction isn't logical, right? It's not something that simply takes place between two contradictory, say, propositions, propositions that can't work together. Contradiction happens in reality in the Marxist sense. It's social contradiction, social antagonism. And the dialectic is a way of grasping contradiction as a kind of principle or function of changes that happen in society. So you see these kind of four dichotomies that I have listed below here: nature and spirit, being, becoming, is, ought, and necessity and freedom, lastly. All of these have a very important temporal dimension to them, which is to say that they kind of express the transformation of social reality, of society in time. So nature and spirit kind of suggests just sort of the world as it's found by people versus spirit as this sort of self-actualizing society. This kind of comes from Hegel. Being and becoming, I guess a recent article was published in PR 133, Sexual Freedom and Capital by Audrey, and she kind of stated it well when she said that there used to be static taxonomies of being, but the epoch of becoming, that is of bourgeois society, came and swept those all away. And then there's is and ought, what's simply extant, what we can talk about as being there, versus what we sort of talk about as a question, as a task, as something belonging to the future. And lastly, I think this is one of the most important ones. When Engels describes the transition to socialism, he talks about it as humanity moving from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. That's in his short essay, which I recommend people read. It's Socialism, Utopians, and Scientific, part of his Anti-Do Ring. But the basic point of that is that the transition to socialism kind of reflects a broader transformation of social reality, that we do things no longer according to how they're dictated to us, but according to our own sort of self-legislation. I wanted to make a couple more points before I move on to the written piece. So kind of asking the question, what was Marxism? And of course, how many Marxisms are there? I'd say that just as there's only one contradiction, there's likewise only one Marxism. Only one Marx, really. A way that one of our pedagogues, Spencer, has put it in reading group is that Marx was a Marxist from the day he's born to the day he dies. And that's kind of a good way of looking at it, because there's a very strong unity, cogency to Marx's sort of way of grasping antagonism socially as the motor of historical change. And the last point I wanted to make before kind of moving on into the written piece is that this title is reversible, right? So when we talk about the dialectic, we're often talking about interpenetrated opposites, or you could say mutual mediation. And what that means is basically that kind of history, in addition to capital taking place within the medium of history, as sort of history being the mode of transmission of capital, we also have the reverse, which is to say, really in Platypus, we say that history is a resource of the present. And that's kind of a way of articulating what it means to talk about history in capital. You know, capital relies on this sort of accumulation of history, which has the potential to lead beyond itself. And so we can't really talk about capital and history without also talking about history and capital. All right, I'm just going to start ahead with the piece. I'll try to read the piece a little slower than I talk normally, so that it doesn't just come out as a blur of words. And that image will become clear in a moment. To talk about the emergence of capital in history is to recall the history of transformations of the social surplus. By social surplus, I mean everything that a society produces over and above its levels of consumption. Capital is not the first form of such surplus, and depending on whether the left ever resumes its historical mission, it might not be the last. That's it. No, I'm just kidding. Capital's distinctness from all previous forms of surplus lies in its generation within itself of the potential for revolutionary transformation beyond itself. The left cannot overcome capitalism without recognizing this revolutionary dynamic, which is immanent in capital, that is, operative from within capital. The left's failure has historically been a function of its misrecognition of this revolutionary dynamic, of its mistaking itself for a political actor that transcends capitalism, impinging upon it from outside. In failing to grasp its own driving force as that of capital itself, the left draws a mistaken parallel between the overcoming of capitalism and that of pre-capitalist social forms. It believes itself able to overgrow society in a gradual process, much like how bourgeois society came gradually to supersede feudal relations, without needing to bother itself with the problem of a qualitative transformation, that is, change of form of society. Inevitably, in forgetting what capital really is, hence also what it could become, the left reconstitutes capital. It further deepens and problematizes the forms it ostensibly wishes to abolish. Walter Benjamin, a preeminent Marxist critical theorist of the early and mid-20th century, captured this phenomenon in his description of the angel of progress, and you can read this along with me. A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. Oh, yeah, his face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing in from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such a violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. During the period of the failure of world revolution, the left attempted to lay claim to a steady, evolutionary vision of quote-unquote progress. But in doing so, it failed to recognize itself as the redeemer of history, becoming instead its thoughtless forward motor. And as the left marched inexorably forwards, the angel of history faced ever more powerlessly backwards. Today is no different. We inherit the aftermath of generations of failure on the left. In this sense, one could say that we owe the present in its totality to the left. One can decide for oneself whether that is good or bad. Now let's start from the beginning, then we will circle back around. This beginning begins about 10,000 years ago with the original emergence of the social surplus in the form of agricultural production, a process commonly referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. Before then, humanity, sorted into tight-knit groups of hunter-gatherers, had produced what it needed, nothing more. Life was characterized by the reproduction of life. Even this germinal form, however, contained an inkling of the division of labor, if one which was incredibly flexible by today's standards. Hunting approximated intellectual and gathering manual labor. I say this because over the course of subsequent history, this division would be reinforced and fractalized in fits and starts. With a slow, imperceptible, and sometimes unwilling introduction of agricultural production, rigidity began to encroach on the family structure. A qualitatively different kind of cooperation was needed to manage the agricultural surplus, and this took the form of patriarchal domination in the family. More children were needed to tend the farms. As humanity began to crowd together, diseases and conflict started to proliferate. Men and women were no longer largely interchangeable in terms of the tasks they could perform, but began to take on more stringently prescribed social functions. Unbeknownst to those who brought it about, this epoch was to lay the basis for all human history to come after. Most importantly, it created the historical conditions for a class to come into control of the social surplus over against a class of slaves. This, the advent of slave labor, became the social basis of the ancient democracies of Greece and later Rome. Freedom was erected on the basis of unfreedom, exchange among people on the basis of exchange of people. Nevertheless, this new constellation of power was unstable. Eventually, inevitably, it collapsed. What took its place was not an advanced, but a regressed social form. The Roman state had watched helplessly on as its civic institutions were hollowed out. Soon this state had to swoop down and substitute itself for society. This resulted in an extreme indistinction of public and private life, what Marx called the democracy of unfreedom. The economic basis of this new political system lay in feudal ownership. A serf would spend a portion of his day working the land for his own subsistence. Then he would devote the rest of his working day towards the production of surplus for his feudal lord, who owned the land itself. This, too, was not a stable system. The Black Death of the mid-14th century was one among the catalyzing occurrences which unchained the serfs, enabling their relocation to the towns. This led to a burgeoning middle class, characterized by the renewal of commerce, which then reacted back on rural agriculture in what was called by Adam Smith an unnatural and retrograde order. This distinctly European process shifted power from the country to the town, generating the need for a centralized state to reconcile the feudal lords with the middle-class burghers. The second half of the medieval epoch was thus characterized by monarchical rule, which played the aristocracy against the middle class and vice versa in order to maintain social stability. Later, this careful power balance would reveal itself as the precedent of the modern capitalist state. This power balance was profoundly disrupted by the French Revolution of 1789, which was made in the name of the Third Estate, as distinct from the other two estates, the priesthood and the aristocracy. The Third Estate included what were then regarded as the productive classes, the middle class, the peasants, and the embryonic proletariat. The authors of the French Revolution sought to wrest state power from the monarchy, which until then had vacillated among the different estates, and to place this power in the hands of society as a whole, which was to be mediated by democratic institutions. This was a bourgeois revolution, intending to sweep away the old powers and to bring about the democratic recognition by bourgeois society of itself. Lurking beneath this revolution, however, was an acute anxiety. This anxiety was formulated by the Abbé Sieyès in his revolutionary pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, where he writes, "Not to go forwards is to go backwards." In rendering society maximally self-conscious by meeting the necessity of revolution, bourgeois intellectuals such as Sieyès were nevertheless aware of the potential for a profound regression. This potential was earlier articulated by Rousseau, who wrote that if the task of freedom is not fulfilled, and I repeat, if the task of freedom is not fulfilled, it will have been better never to have left the state of nature. In falling below its own threshold, bourgeois society risked becoming involved in what Kant called glittering misery, a state of profound injustice that nevertheless contradicted itself with the empty pretense of justice. Hence, despite its manifold gains, the bourgeois revolution seemed to harbor a fundamental ambivalence. Freedom and unfreedom appeared that they would soon part ways, as if at a crossroads. In capitalism, this ambivalence would reveal itself as a contradiction of bourgeois subjectivity itself, as its sundering into two antagonistic poles. Freedom and unfreedom could not stand apart from each other, but proved to be dialectically interdependent. Now we have arrived at the beginning of the 19th century, which was characterized by a development more momentous than any that had taken place since the Neolithic Revolution. This was the advent of industrial production. Beginning in Britain, this development soon swept the entire world. Peasants were drawn out of the countryside and once again relocated to the towns, where they operated machines that astronomically increased the productivity of their labor, a phenomenon known as Proletarianization. On the basis of this long, grueling, often deadly work, bourgeois society entered into contradiction with itself. On one hand, the society based on free exchange of equivalents appeared to have finally been realized. On the other hand, no sooner had the society been realized than its realization had taken the shape of a total unfreedom. The worker's liberation appeared as his desolation, the reproduction of his life as his imperative to work unto death. For Marx, however, the task of working through this unfreedom held the promise to the eventual transcendence of all human history thus far. This working through, or critique, of bourgeois society in crisis took the practical form of the class struggle, which historically was organized and led by the left. And this is where my teaching gets a little bit top heavy. Before circling back around to today's left, I wanted to talk about one more experience which was formative for Marxist philosophy of history. I mean the revolutions of 1848, culminating in 1951 in the coup d'etat of Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, in France. The coup d'etat of the nephew Bonaparte expressed a new historical form in which the bourgeoisie had become too senile, but the proletariat remained too immature to rule. The resulting class stalemate involved the return of ostensibly pre-bourgeois forms, which crushed parliamentary democracy, replacing it with a regressive reign of a monarch. Unable to resolve its own contradictions, society came to depend on the parasitic excrescence of the state. Yet this new constellation of power, known by Marx and Engels as Bonapartism, remained capitalist through and through. Far from a return to feudal relations, Bonapartism was an historical expression of the regression of bourgeois social relations in capitalism. That is to say that the democratic mediation of society that was so sought after in the French Revolution had become blocked by the internecine class struggle. Because bourgeois society had failed to go forwards, as Sieyès had been afraid of, it was forced backwards. Learning from this experience of Bonapartist regression, Marx was able to specify even further his understanding of the relation between revolution and the state. In the Communist Manifesto, published a year before this period, Marx and Engels sought to show that society was to be transformed under, quote unquote, the proletariat organizes the ruling class, which first had to, quote unquote, win the battle of democracy. The state, Marx recognized, would prove to be the chief instrument of the class struggle. Its existence in the form of what Lenin later called special bodies of armed men expressed the class domination of the bourgeoisie. By taking control of the state, the proletariat could enable society to sort itself out, as it were, under a new mode of production. Following the coup d'etat, however, Marx transferred to the context of the state his earlier discovery that the proletariat was not simply a passive category waiting to inherit society, but instead actively had to constitute itself as a class. Of course, class consciousness, even for the younger Marx, was never an immediate, but always a mediated expression of the class struggle, which is to say that to take up one's own consciousness as a phenomenon, a necessary form of appearance, of capitalist contradiction, would open the possibility of revolutionary activity. But no longer did historical conditions allow for a surprise attack on the state, as socialists like Blanqui had encouraged. State power could not simply be tossed into the lap of the proletariat, but had to be seized and smashed. that is, wrested by the proletariat from an ever more exclusive set of hands, then subordinated to society under socialist leadership. In the course of the revolutionary struggle, the proletariat was thus faced with the task of ripening its own consciousness of the necessity of revolution. What Marx discovered from the experience of 1848 to 1851 was that without class consciousness, society's movement towards socialism would be indefinitely deferred, and this in the form of a Bonaparte. But far from one-sidedly foreclosing socialism, Bonapartism indicated the overripeness of the state for a socialist transfer of power. This transfer of power and the tasks it entailed, termed by Marx the dictatorship of the proletariat, were to allow society to transition into its next historical form. The hypertrophic state had set itself up as the sole target of revolutionary activity. Regression itself paved the way to revolution. One more with this, and then we're going to move back to the left. After perfecting this insight, Marx took to the books again throughout the 1850s. His mission was to articulate class consciousness at the level of theory. This is the context in which Marx's mature critique of political economy must be situated. Central to Marx's further development, that is, specification of his critique, was the category of surplus value perfected from David Ricardo. Surplus value, as Marx came to recognize, was contradicted between its production on one hand and its realization on the other. Capital tended to reduce socially necessary labor time by increasing the productivity of labor, yet labor time was still posited as the sole measure and source of wealth. Underemployment and overproduction, therefore, became endemic in capitalism as expressions of its central contradiction. Nevertheless, building on his study of the previous period, Marx knew that overthrowing capitalism was not a purely economic process. And I'd say that there is no such thing as a purely economic process on top of that. Instead, this task of overthrowing capitalism meant a weak link in the social totality, this being the political state, of which the working class had to become conscious in order to use to its own advantage. In other words, capitalism led to its own overthrow, not out of some purely economic process, but because working class forms of action posed the question of the interaction of economics and politics. In demanding the right to work, in other words, workers were unconsciously demanding the political abolition of the society that depended on a reserve army of labor, that is, on unemployment. This bourgeois right, that being the right to work, had become self-contradictory in capitalism. With its completion, capitalism would begin to be overcome. But completing bourgeois right, in the form of sending everybody to work, necessitated in turn the dictatorship of the proletariat. This wouldn't give the answer to capitalism so much as pose capitalism concretely as a question of politics. Marxism itself was not the answer, but the question. Being a scientific theory of historical transition, it did not preordain images of the good society, it critiqued them. As a phenomenon of discontent with capitalism, utopia was, in its significance, negative. Capital and labor had to be overcome on their own basis. The coming society could not arrive ready-made. All right. We see now that the left is not some specific organizational body or some laundry list of political policies specified in advance, but rather the form of historical consciousness that mediates the recognition of capital as a contradictory social potential. Its goal then is not to oppose, but to expropriate capital, for capital expresses, in alienated form, the totality of human needs and creative capacities. A merely anti-capitalist framework fails to preserve the potential that is implicit in what it opposes. Inevitably, to maintain itself, such a framework requires that what it opposes remain in its present form. Hence, in believing itself already to transcend capitalism, the present left imprisons itself in its own outlook, foreclosing the possibility of a truly epical transcendence. This is the difference between the rebel and the revolutionary as formulated by renegade Trotskyist Christopher Hitchens following Sartre. And this is actually a quote that Ethan shared to Facebook, so I can thank him for it. I'll get around to reading Hitchens later. The rebel secretly quite wants the world and the system to remain as it is. Its permanence, after all, is the guarantee of his continuing ability to quote unquote rebel. The revolutionary, in contrast, really wishes to overthrow and replace existing conditions. And what does that mean? It means that Marx sought not merely to rebel against, but to overthrow society. He premised his social theory, if it can even be called that, on one fundamental insight. that capitalism is nothing if not the potential for the self-reorganization of society, nothing if not the potential for its own overcoming in communism. To make good once and for all on this potential, the left must first remember the insight. Almost done. I don't propose with my talk to resolve any long-standing dilemmas, only to leave you with a way of interrogating the left's response to capitalism as a problem of its subjectivity. I intend to leave you with the thought that yes, the point is to change the world, not interpret it, as Marx has said in his theses on Feuerbach, very famously, but that there can be no change, at least not from the left, without sober interpretation. For what the left opposes is not immediately society, but society as mediated, that is, society in the medium of the left itself. The left, therefore, can change the world only by way of ruthless self-critique. To avoid succumbing to the assumptions of this world it wishes to change, in other words, the left must view itself symptomatically, that is, as part of the problem. There has been, and there could yet be, no higher form of political consciousness than this, the dialectical critique of the left by itself as a phenomenon, as an appearance, of the crisis and contradiction of bourgeois society and capitalism. In the heyday of the left, that is, you could say up till the years 1917, 18, 19, this dialectical or mediating component of the problem was overlooked, that is, neglected from either side by opportunists and anarchists alike. By the opportunists who conceived of revolution as a purely objective process, consummating itself in the new society without need of critical intervention, and by the anarchists who, taking the reverse view, imagined the revolution taking place overnight, as if by the flip of a switch. While these standpoints appear diametrically opposed, truly they lean into and reinforce one another. They both construe the left in an immediate relation to history, overlooking the diverse mediations that the left must pass through if it is truly to change the world. Their shared moment is their neglect of the necessity of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat as the transitional phase to communism. But today, in the absence of the Party for Socialism, even the distinction between these standpoints, not to speak of their fundamental identity, has grown obscure. The present impossibility of transformative change has stranded each and every salient interpretation that could cast light on the phenomena of capitalism. To conclude, if I can ask bluntly, in coming history, is the left to consist of rebels or revolutionaries? This question is not purely predictive. As I've heard other members of Platypus say, it contains an ought. To feel the real substance of the problem is invariably to task oneself with solving it. And I'll leave you with one more quote, which we normally put at the beginning, but I kind of put it here to kind of summarize. One more quote before opening for questions or just discussion, this time from Marx's Grundrisse, dating from 1857 to 1858. You can read along with me. It says, "The ancient conception in which man always appears in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition as the aim of production seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, and the rest of individuals produced in universal exchange? What if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as those of so-called nature? What if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions without any preconditions other than the antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, that is, the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and the destruction of all fixed one-sided purposes, as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior, and this is so insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or, where it appears to be satisfied with itself, is vulgar and mean. All right, this is just discussion / Q&A. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Justin.
No problem. Anyone got any questions?
I had a question, and I'll just ask it quickly because I do want to turn this over to other people. Oh, Jesus Christ. So how should I phrase my question? Well, there was a lot in there that was really good, but it was condensed, and so I wanted to ask about a point, and maybe you can expand on it. I just picked up this book in a used bookstore about the world significance of the French Revolution, and they were talking about there's a resonance with some of the themes that came up there, with how you were talking about the third estate, and how they were trying to, break away or overturn the kind of privileges and the exceptions that the first and second estates had, as being the clergy and the aristocracy. And you also talked about how in traditional society there were these rigid social roles. You were just expected to occupy certain positions in society, and the third estate wanted to overthrow that entirely. They wanted to be able to relate to each other, not through some divinely ordained stratification, but just on the basis of the free labor and being humans. The claim that this dude in the book I was reading made was that the third estate was trying to establish a classless society. By that, he just meant like overturning the caste system that had been so long dominant. If that was their imagination, these forerunners, these revolutionaries of bourgeois society, that they wanted to establish a classless society, how then do we get to Marx's time, where you have society with this clear self-divide between proletarians and the bourgeoisie? I wondered if you could speak about that contradiction, and how does that make sense in terms of this revolt of the third estate that you were bringing up?
Yeah, so actually I went to the Philadelphia. Sometimes I go to the Philadelphia reading group, and Danny's there, and he has some good examples, and I'm just going to kind of plagiarize one of his examples, where he said that if you drop Adam Smith in anywhere in the South, right, or anywhere in America really, and they just see this big police station over there, they'll be like, wait, that's not bourgeois society. That's a caste, right? That's a caste of people over and against a society that's kind of making itself independent. You don't need a special body of armed men. The point of bourgeois society is basically that it regulates itself, through this sort of mediation. So the first thing I'd say in response to your question is that absolutely, I mean, the point of the revolution, the bourgeois revolution, was to abolish, what could be called class, but really what should be called caste, right? It's to put everybody on more or less the same footing. And Marx talks about this kind of in his earlier writings, where he compares feudal to bourgeois society and talks about the relationship between the social and the political and feudal society. He says basically, I mean, I guess to condense his point, the social is kind of immediately political, right? It is sort of immediately political in the sense that all social relationships are politicized. Whereas the point of bourgeois society was kind of to particularize, to make an actual concrete entity, a political constitution, right? Something with sort of rules and laws that the entirety of society can continually use to reconstitute itself. And now Trotsky, kind of in Results and Prospects, where he's kind of condensing all this history and going over it. I guess it's this very good chapter, 1789, 1848, 1905. This is, I think he kind of has the answer to this question, where he says, possibly the answer to your question. I think the metaphor he uses is that the bourgeois revolution, the French Revolution in particular, is the lion leaping at the old powers. But the issue is with the emergence of class, following the Industrial Revolution, and I can talk about that in a second, but following the emergence of class in the Industrial Revolution, um, the issue, I guess it's kind of an issue that society's capacity to recognize itself as this one coherent nation, as this one coherent body revolting against the old powers, that itself becomes blocked as a function of the class struggle. Um, and Marx kind of describes this in terms of the penetration, which is, it's dialectic, so you're going to have to say penetration a lot. The penetration of these sort of you could say the penetration of this sort of alienated form of exchange into labor power itself. Labor power itself becomes a commodity. And as a result of that, I guess you could just say that, I mean, on a really commonsensical level, the worker and the capitalist have different interests in terms of reproducing this nation. You could say that the default is that the worker still works for the capitalist, right? The state becomes kind of a means of maintaining this default social relation, which in fact society is beginning to outgrow. And I think that's fundamentally what Marx is saying when he talks about the central contradiction of capitalism between bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production, that in this contradiction, society kind of points beyond itself, which is to say that really the only thing preventing a socialist society from coming about is the state, right? It's the special bodies of armed men, which are the state. It's the fact that you can have these, that you can drop Adam Smith in society and today, and he points to these policemen as being, a parasitic excrescence, I guess. Whereas like really the point of socialism is just to kind of get beyond the default state of civil society, which is mediated by the state in the form of this sort of Bonapartist bureaucracy. I guess one way of getting at that is kind of through Marx's discussion of bureaucracy, even before he had kind of discovered industrial production, as the inversion of means and ends, where the bureaucracy's own activity becomes something it itself promotes. But does that kind of answer your question a little bit?
I found it interesting. You remarked about the lion pouncing and how society today almost still imagines itself as a kind of third estate, as a cohesive unity without any kind of self-contradiction, running right down the middle of it. And I can imagine that troubles our politics too, right? A socialist party, if it were to be reconstituted, would have to address the fact that actually society as a whole, we're not all on the same page. That's more of an illusion, but it's a sort of necessary inheritance of history. Like that's how these bourgeois revolutions understood themselves. That's how they took place, but that's no longer adequate. I wondered if anyone else had thoughts on this issue, or you can move along to other questions.
Yeah, we can. If anyone else has anything to say about that, we can. Nathan also has a question, and I can move on to that if anyone else wants to say anything.
Oh, I'm happy to read it out to you if you need a moderator.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so Nathan asks, if being anti-capitalist is to foreclose on the possibility capitalism presents, and the self-transformation of capitalism is what creates the possibility of its historic transcendence, does this task the left with acting as capitalists? I think he's asking about this anti-capitalist, like almost uber-capitalist dichotomy that you traced out. Maybe you could speak more about how socialism is not simply anti-capitalism.
Well, yeah, I would say that following the seizure of state power by the proletariat, organized under the party, there would totally be a sort of acting as capitalists type deal. I mean, there were definitely, the proletariat would be forced to do things that the capitalists would do. And it's kind of, I mean, you see the parallel today with like Trump and Biden, where Biden is being forced to do the things that Trump does. It's that there's a sort of revolutionary necessity that any party organized, to create or bring about socialism, or let alone any bourgeois party, would have to meet in some sense. And yeah, the point that I would really try to bring to bear on anti-capitalism. I lost my, oh yeah. So I guess I was thinking about this earlier as essentially so actually this goes back to your question, Ethan. Really, if you want to locate why a simple petty bourgeois discontent, a program of petty bourgeois discontent can't work in capitalism, why it always reconstitutes the same problems it seeks to resolve, it goes back to what I was saying about my teach-in, where workers, what they fundamentally want and what they fundamentally demand is the right to work. But in a society in which unemployment is endemic, through the obviation of labor in the form of machines, what they're fundamentally demanding, I guess, on an unconscious, or varying levels of conscious register, is kind of the abolition of this society. And I guess what I would really say, again, to your question and possibly to Nathan's question, is that what regression is a kind of non-recognition of the contradiction that kind of inheres in any sort of political action, in any sort of attempt to transform society. Not being able to recognize the contradiction deepens the contradiction, and that's kind of what anti-capitalism is. It's a left that situates itself outside capital, as kind of a function of, you could say, I mean, this is kind of good to discuss in the context of Fordism and neoliberalism, because I mean, you have Fordism as being this historical epic lasting from about the 20s to the 60s, if I'm correct, to the 70s really, and then neoliberalism kind of superseding Fordism in the 80s and 90s. There's this kind of mistaken belief that neoliberalism is anti-Fordism. Really, it's post-Fordism, which is to say it's a sublation. It preserves and at the same time cancels Fordism. What it's society having to change itself in order to stay the same in response to discontents that are particularly coming from the absence of any organized left. So basically what I'm trying to say there is that the left has already tried being anti-capitalist, and what it got was neoliberalism. And now it's getting post-neoliberalism. And really what this depends upon is some sort of political body that can mediate the contradiction, that can recognize the contradiction for what it is, rather than simply set itself against different forms of appearance of the contradiction. Does that make any sense, Nathan? Does that kind of answer part of your question, I hope?
I think there's also the Lenin quote about how, you have to be, if you're taking yourself seriously as a communist, you need to be as radical as reality itself. And going to the heart of just how revolutionary and radical capitalism is, communism would have to be that. It would have to be, and Lenin also talks about how communism would be achieved on the basis of capitalism itself. It would not be just any kind of one-sided negation, but it would be, continuing and negating and overcoming and all the words that go into that German word, Aufhebung.
Another way of saying it is that when the left really demands to kind of, I guess when the left demands this sort of control over society, what it's really demanding is the abolition of the individual subject. It's demanding itself to be instated in charge of society as a social subject. It's demanding society recognize itself as social, rather than just as like sort of mediated by the consciousness of individuals. And that's kind of what the party is for. Does anyone else have any questions? But yeah, that's a good point, Ethan. Being as radical as reality itself. Marxism is a way of raising to a higher level of self-consciousness what's already going on. It's not a matter of simply, I mean, you could say like pre-specifying the political form you need.
Hi, Justin. I'm wondering what the motivation was for this teach-in. Capital and History, it's like one of our first readings within the reading group. I think it's within week A. And so in the context of where we are now in the reading group, the revolutionary Marxism, and then as well as the symptomology of the dead left. So yeah, what was the impetus behind Capital and History at this time?
So the basic reason that I'm doing it this time is because I was supposed to do it in the fall semester, but I just didn't have the time. But that is kind of reflected in how I tried to structure the teach-in. I tried to lead up to the years 1858, maybe up to 1860, kind of to go over the 10 weeks of Marxism we do and get people acquainted with not only the capital in history, but also kind of, I mean, really, this kind of violates what a capital in history teaching should be, I think, in a sense, because Chris Cutrone really says in his article that the point isn't progression, but the fundamental sort of historical or philosophical historical understanding that informs the thesis of regression in Platypus. But I really wanted to kind of tackle regression explicitly because in our spring syllabus, what we're dealing with is a problem of recognizing that regression and a problem of how even the recognition of regression itself becomes blocked as a function of reification of the sort of failures and opportunism of the labor movement, sort of towards the beginning of the 20th century leading up to 1917. So I was really trying to, I guess really the point would be that I was trying to extend it into the spring syllabus so that people would still be able to, like, you know, if they wanted to hop on to talk about the sort of political forms that could, you know, actually mediate the recognition of capital and all that stuff, they could just sort of hop right on. I don't know how much to what extent it worked, but it was just something I was trying.
I could say something. So first of all, thanks for the great presentation. And the second thing, it's kind of a comment, but it's also a bit of a question, I guess. You brought up one of my favorite Avi Sia's quotes, not to go forwards is to go backwards, which kind of reminds me of a different quote from Horkheimer we read from his aphorisms, where he says that until it is victorious, the revolution is no good. And I guess I'm trying to think about this in relation to the fact that the left today, like where it doesn't like reject the bourgeois revolution, it kind of just like erases it from history in a certain sense. Like, so for example, I feel like this distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism is something that I had never encountered before Platypus. Like, this is completely unique to Platypus, but like when you go back and read the original text, you kind of, I guess the thing is this, the emancipatory potential of bourgeois society has kind of been completely forgotten. And it's like, there's only this idea of like going straight from feudalism into capitalism. And this is kind of why like Adam Smith, for example, is perceived as being an apologist for capitalism, because people don't like recognize the potential that was there. So I guess like my question is like how do you see these two things being connected?
Yeah, so really, I think that's a question of how these bourgeois thinkers appear in conditions of regression, how Adam Smith and Sieyès and Rousseau, especially Rousseau and Smith, oh, and Sieyès, how they all appear kind of in capitalism, because capitalism fundamentally, it doesn't just, I mean, to really think about regression, it has to be thought of as kind of the way these people appear now to us, and how really what we're looking at isn't necessarily bourgeois thinkers who become apologetic of capitalism just plain outright, so much as really they be like the attempt to appropriate bourgeois thinkers in capitalism itself becomes sub-bourgeois. And I guess a way of putting that is that kind of the state is what expresses the regression of bourgeois society. But Adam Smith, for example, when he's talking about revolution, he's talking about, again, like any revolutionary, he's talking about meeting the necessity of revolution, right? So he's kind of explaining this sort of mercantilist system of Britain as a regression. You know, he's saying that we really need to, I guess, be more bourgeois. It was the demand to be more bourgeois kind of was expressing itself as an awareness of the potential for regression. And really, I would just say that capitalism is kind of that potential become actual. And it has to do, oh, one sec, Emilio's here. It has to do with the fact that really the left, I mean, what you raise a very good point, Diaz, about the sort of folding of bourgeois society and capitalism together. That's the mistake, I would say. That's just the mistake that the left makes, because it assumes that, you know, on those grounds, it assumes that either these thinkers are bad or they're good. and we have to either follow them or we have to reject them. But really, either one expresses kind of this crisis by which it becomes employed by capitalism as capitalism's own means of reconstituting itself, right? So really what the left kind of misses is that there's a regression, that being capitalism happening from the time of these thinkers onward. And that in attempting to kind of address this regression by either reiterating or simply rejecting these thinkers, it kind of, it becomes used, really. The left gets used by capital. That's kind of a way of putting it, is that without this sort of form of subjectivity that the left should have, without the party, really, without a way of recognizing what's going on, the left is really just an instrument for the reconstitution of capital. And it does that precisely through the demand for bourgeois society. The demand to overcome capitalism appears as the demand to really just go back to bourgeois society. And that's kind of the crux of the issue there, is how society appears and how to address these forms of appearance as like not straightforward, as contradictory, really. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, definitely.
I think I would just add that it would be one thing if we could just set aside Smith and Rousseau and all these people and never have to talk about them again. But they continually come back up in conversation because, as Marx says in the manifesto, capital made society in the image of itself. It pushed out all other forms of existing in the world. It's totalizing in that way. And so there's no other recourse but to the kind of bourgeois society that these guys imagined. And we're always trying to achieve that. We're trying to achieve this society based on wage labor that these guys wrote about and said ought to be a good thing. But of course, as you traced out in your talk, after the Industrial Revolution, that begins to undermine itself. And I think that one part of regression is thinking of capitalism as this thing that was constituted maybe 200 years ago, and it's just been on autopilot, or maybe it's run by a bunch of evil capitalists pulling the puppet strings. Treating capitalism as a thing made 200 years ago is not how Marx wrote about it. Marx wrote about it as a relation that we are constantly reproducing. Every day when we go to work, or when we demand to go to work, we are reproducing this relation that is in self-contradiction. And so the part that has been totally dropped in regression is, how do we stop this cycle? How do we interrupt us while we're continually reproducing this contradiction? And it would take a political form to make the contradiction conscious and for it to have real control over the situation. I would just add that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would double up on that. I think that's absolutely correct, that capitalism is really, or even more than a relation. Well, capital is certainly a relation, but capitalism is kind of the self-contradiction of this totality of social relations, of bourgeois society. That it's the elision of bourgeois society into capitalism. Kind of, you could say that is regression. Really just the elision of those 30 to 50 some years, not necessarily concretely, but the idea that fundamentally the red thread, you could say, begins with Marx. That's kind of a function of regression, the idea that Marx was the first revolutionary, which I think a lot of people on the left kind of implicitly have. The idea that bourgeois revolutions were all moot. These are just some of the sort of forms of appearance of the contradiction, you could say, the phenomena of the contradiction that kind of capitalism uses to its own advantage. Capitalism is it's a revolutionary system in and of itself. It kind of, and what you did a good job of drawing out, Ethan, I think, is that forms can appear non-capitalist, right? The Russian Tsarist state, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks disagreed as to what that state was. Was it capitalist, or was it simply just like feudal? But capitalism really, it employs prior forms of society kind of in its own service, if that makes any sense. It kind of takes these prior forms of society and uses them to get across the idea that it's not contradictory, I guess. These are all forms of appearance of capitalism. Society can appear in different ways. Do we have any more questions? Hi, Mary. I noticed you were at Ethan's teaching when I was watching it last week. I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but I just wanted to know, I guess, if you just wanted to say what you thought, or like kind of, just talk about, to any extent, really, even briefly, if you want, just like kind of if you have any questions or anything you wanted to raise.
Yeah, I thought it was a very, very interesting, sort of thorough way of showing how, I guess, Marx perceived history, and the way that history, like how I guess class struggles happen through history, and just the patterns that humanity falls into over and over again. Yeah, I guess right now I'm just sort of just waiting in the background and just kind of trying to absorb information. And I haven't actually attended the reading groups yet because like I have stuff going on the weekend. But over the summer, I'm hoping to get more involved with the platypus.
Oh yeah, no worries at all if you can't attend the reading groups now. Yeah, we totally understand everyone's busy, and that's kind of how I felt at the beginning of Platypus. It's just I think I started on the Trotsky reading, and then I read Lenin's State and Revolution. I was just like trying to absorb as much as I could, and I even took a break from it for a while and came back because it was honestly a little bit overwhelming. But yeah, but thank you. I appreciate your comments. That again, yeah, capitalism is it's a revolutionary system. It's a way of appearing as what it's not, I guess.
Did you find anything particularly challenging when you were preparing for this? Any concept you were not sure how to express?
On a general level, my thoughts appear out of order when I have them. So I really have a hard time editing them into like a reasonable order. But yeah, let me actually look through, because there's tons of stuff that I was just unsure about for a while. I was actually, Ethan, I find it funny that the first thing you asked about was the bourgeois revolution, because I think that's actually the part that I left most underspecified in my teaching, because I was struggling a little bit with Adam Smith and how he recognized this potential for regression and mercantilism. I just don't think I've really read Smith thoroughly enough last semester, so I need to really get back on that, hopefully next fall.
There's a reason Diaz asked about it too. It is one of the things that nobody really talks about before Platypus, and it is still difficult as a Platypus member to really grasp or to articulate just how these people imagined their historical task, what they thought they were doing, and then how that begins to become untenable, or how it begins to fall into contradiction. Just telling students that capitalism is not Adam Smith's world. It's a world like constantly trying to achieve his world, and yet also falling short of it. That's a hard concept to grasp, especially when he's claimed basically just by the right. The left completely stopped taking him seriously a long time ago, and the right is the only people that want to take him seriously, and they just say he's an apologist for laissez-faire imperialist capitalism or whatever. So I don't think it's unusual for anyone to have trouble articulating this bourgeois society stuff.
Yeah, and going back to Kant and Rousseau, especially too, they were vindicated by capitalism in a sense. They were both very worried about, I guess you could also say this of Smith, but they were both very worried about this potential, this potential for society not to be what it says it is, following some sort of development. They were worried about stagnation fundamentally. That's what a revolutionary should be worried about. They should be worried about this idea. I guess one thing that I've read Luxemburg say in one of her letters is like opportunism is like a swamp plant, in swift waters it dies of itself. And that's kind of the attitude that a lot of these people, even these bourgeois thinkers, had. They knew that even their own movement within that movement was kind of threatened by this sort of potential for people to come on the scene who didn't necessarily, I mean, in a very crude sense, know what they were doing. I guess you could even say that the problem of opportunism was in some sense still a bourgeois problem. I wouldn't know how to specify that any further, though.
Well, and then what's the part at the very end of the Marx Grundrisse excerpt about the modern world versus the ancients and the narrow satisfaction and vulgar and mean, all that stuff? There's a way in which capitalism looks worse than what came before it, and there's a way in which all the problems of history come to a head, and they're, we've seen the worst crimes against humanity in the most recent period in history, the last few hundred years. And that's what all of history begins to look like. And the hardest part is saying that these people that, began in bourgeois, radical philosophy and following this line all the way up through Marx, they thought that history had turned out like that, but it could turn out differently, that they thought that there was a potential there unrealized. And hopefully that potential still exists for us, but we have to draw attention to the fact that it's not terribly clear, that it's become more opaque since when Marx was writing about it. And hopefully we can return to asking that question again: what potential is there for real authentic freedom? That was the question they were asking themselves, and Platypus exists to show all the ways that question is not exactly being asked in the same way anymore, if it's being asked at all. And that's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, one thing I would say more about these bourgeois revolutionists is that they came to the recognition, I mean, especially with Constant, that they were bringing about a new form of society, one that had never happened in all of history. And they were fundamentally uncertain. I mean, Kant knew this too, is that they had this sort of discovery really of civil society, and they didn't quite know what to do with it except to advance it forwards. They knew there was no going back, except there was going back ultimately, in a sense, and that's capitalism.
Yeah, about like Adam Smith, I feel like the left is like so quick to denounce him, but in doing so, they kind of forget that he himself was a bourgeois revolutionary, and that it would be the task of the left itself to make good on the promise of bourgeois society that he envisioned. I guess he's kind of accusing them of failing to realize that. And maybe that kind of explains why he's so disliked.
Maybe if Adam Smith was dropped into American society today and saw a police station, he'd just join Platypus. I don't know. Do we have any more questions? I don't know how long these usually last, actually, so we can end whenever people have kind of exhausted their questions.
Last call for questions. You want to pitch the events we have coming up one more time?
Oh yeah, what are those? Could somebody else pitch them? I mean, we have the reading group